Oh my. Here we are, a little more than a week after the election by the time this podcast drops. And I don't know about you all, but I'm still kind of shaking my head, wondering how this happened, what went wrong or right, for depending on where you stand, the Democratic Party did wrong, what did the Harris campaign perhaps do wrong. I've read so many analysis pieces I can't even tell you from all different publications. Probably some of my followers will think, well, Katie, you're reading publications that confirm your pre existing beliefs. And if that's true, guilty as charged. I probably have been reading those publications. But I felt like one of the best people we could talk to about all of this is my friend Jen Psaki. Jen, of course, served under two administrations, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and now she is crushing it over at MSNBC. I think she's a really welcome and much needed voice, although we can talk about the media as well with Jen. Jen, gosh, hi, so much to discuss. How are you?
I mean, hi. I have spent the last several days, just as probably anyone listening has, really thinking about all of the things you just said. Reading so many pieces. There's a lot of takes on there out there. A lot of them are bad, but some of them are interesting. And what I've tried to really force myself to do in this moment is be humble about what I misread and what I didn't see. What many of us misread. I'm not the only one. And what it tells us about a huge disconnect out there from the party with there are a lot of reasons why,
Yes,
but
so many.
I've tried to be very introspective about that, and not blame. I think there's also a lot of blame gaming going on out there, which I don't think that doesn't mean you can't be critical. It just means people who say this is the fault of all white women, it's like, or fault of Latinos. It's like, as you know, Katie, that's not how democracy works. I mean, people decide who they wanna vote for based on who they think is going to best represent their views. You either move people to do that or you don't. So that's what I've spent the last couple of days. For me, it's like digging into it and studying and being in the research phase, and that's where I feel like I am in this moment.
I also think it's going to be helpful, Jen. I think when you started at MSNBC, correct me if I'm wrong, I had this bonehead idea. I was like, Jen, why don't you do your show every weekend from a different location? Why don't you go to the middle of the
Mhm.
country? Why don't you do the show from Dayton, Ohio? Why don't you do the show from Houston, Texas? Why don't you better represent
Yes.
what the American people are thinking and feeling? Now, of course, I'm patting myself on the back for that idea, but honestly, I think you're right. I think that the media is occupied by coastal elites
Mhm.
who pretty much all went to pretty good schools. They don't represent a real diversity of backgrounds socioeconomically anyway. And that's not true. I'm making a generalization here, but for the most part. And I just feel like they're also not reporting out in the field as much. I mean, one of the things that bugs me when I watch cable news, and by the way, we're talking about very small percentage of the
Mhm.
population that's actually watching cable news these days, is I never see them talking to real people. They're always sitting at a desk, doing a lot of navel gazing. I mean, that's not to say I don't really appreciate hearing what these very smart people have to say. I love your show, Jen. I love hearing you talk to people, but it does feel like it is just not touching and not talking and not sharing stories of people's lives. And it's just gotten very, super high level. And nobody seems to be really rolling up their sleeves and getting out there in the country and talking to voters.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that too, as you know. I mean, one thing
It's
I will say,
expensive.
it's expensive, that's one of them, and I remember us talking about that, and I have tried to go out as much as I can and actually spend. I mean, I was in Michigan a week before the election. I've gone out on the road with candidates. You do have actual I was in New Hampshire for days around the Republican primary, and to your point, you do have actual real conversations that make you question and think. One of the things I've thought a lot about, and I can only speak for myself and how I approach things moving forward, is that you get into an easy cycle of what is your reaction to this crazy thing Trump said? What is your reaction to that crazy thing Trump said? And as you know, and I'd be interested in your thought on this given your long history, he is still a story. He's the president-elect of the United States. People can't not cover him or not talk about him. But I do wonder if the react to the crazy thing he said is the most informative and right way that we should be approaching things. And
Maybe, yeah. I think a lot of people are looking at that. Did journalists, and by the way, you know, we'll talk about this. Media is so fragmented. I always say mass media is now an oxymoron. So when you even say the media, who and what are you talking about? But I see your point. I think often they miss the forest for the trees, because I think the focus was probably a little bit more on the candidate and his outrageous behavior, instead of the fans and the people who were
yes.
gravitating and attracted to him, and why. And when you did see stories, and maybe this is because of my specific algorithms that I get fed, when you did see stories about Trump supporters, they were often mocking them. They
Mhm.
were interviewing them. They didn't understand the issues. They were kind of making fun of them, honestly, some of the stuff I saw talking to Trump supporters. But wouldn't it have been interesting if you had taken a Trump supporter a week and really gone home with that person and talked about their lives, and talked about, what they were worried about, and talked about how they were struggling to raise their kids, or talked about all kinds of things, this feeling of global insecurity and paying for all these wars when we have so many problems at home. I think it might have been really illuminating, Jen.
Well, I also think, certainly longtime Trump supporters are part of it, absolutely, but I also think for the Democratic Party, and also for the media in a different way, and I wanna come back to that in a second, it's people who left the Democratic Party, who had long supported Democratic candidates or Democratic policies and decided they weren't being heard anymore, and those people, maybe they stayed home, maybe they voted for Trump. But maybe they didn't vote at all, and there's a group that I feel like wasn't heard or listened to either.
But that's not a new phenomenon, Jen.
No.
I mean, we've seen sort of this shift by blue collar or working class folks in this country moving towards the Republican Party. And, I know it's maybe it would have looked hollow, but I have a friend and we talk about this stuff all the time. We were like, why isn't Kamala Harris going out and talking to more factory workers? Why isn't she like putting on a hard hat and really talking to people, everyday people, a little bit more? I think she could have done that throughout the administration. I'm dying to talk to you about sort of whether she was set up for failure or success in the administration. But what were we talking about? I have so many things
No,
swirling
no,
in
no,
my
me
head, Jen.
too, and I don't wanna get off topic of what we were talking about, is, like, having the conversations with the people who really I mean, the other thing I think, and I don't wanna get off the topic of working class voters because I think that is a big yes, you're right, the trends have been moving and the trends they've been moving. I do think this was a very startling outcome in terms of the big shifts among many different demographic groups, Latino men, young people. I mean, it was not just white working class voters. It was beyond
Right.
that, which I think is something that's important to be part of the conversation. The other thing I think that's important to reflect on is just a misread of abortion politics. And what I mean by that is the majority of the country does believe in a woman's right to make choices about her own healthcare, bodily autonomy, whatever you want to call it, abortion, whatever. 7 states voted to protect abortion rights and still voted for Trump, right? And there was this assumption, I'm not the only one, but I'm just reflecting on my own assumptions that were inaccurate, that those people who voted to protect it or felt strongly about it would recognize that he was a person who opposed it. And that's not
And why
true.
didn't they? And why didn't they?
It's a good I am also a believer we don't know all the answers yet. So this is how I've thought about it to
Okay,
date.
okay.
The how I've thought about it to date is either, there is a belief that he wasn't a believer in abortion ban, and he sort of said different iterations of that over the course of time, despite his role in, nominating Supreme Court justices who did implement that policy or did rule that way. There may be, people may have just, and this is why it's interesting to talk to these people, and this is why I don't know the answer yet, may have had the view that I can protect abortion rights this way, but I still think the economy is nobody's hearing me and he hears me better, so I'm gonna do both. I'm not sure. I don't know that we entirely know, but I think there was an overconfidence because of these special elections and because of the midterms where there is a smaller turnout, so perhaps the more exercised, excited people turn out, and a
Mhm.
belief it was going to replicate itself. It didn't. There's a lesson in that somewhere, and I don't think we know all the answers yet.
I don't think he does give out the vibe, if you will, which seems to be the word of the year, that he feels super strongly about, uh about limiting abortion rights, right? I think people see his lifestyle, but then you do look at the Supreme Court, then you do look at JD Vance,
Mhm.
and you're like, how can you not be worried about this? And, it's interesting. I know Ronald Reagan, this is how old I am, Jen. He campaigned a lot on, restricting abortion, I think, in order to win over the evangelical vote. And then once in office, he basically made it priority number 79. Like nothing was really ever done about it. So maybe people just sense from Donald Trump this wasn't an issue he cared about. But on the other hand, Jen, I mean, hello, you you look at the Supreme Court justices and you look at, Dobbs and you're thinking, "Wait, how can you compartmentalize these things?"
But that is my question, and what's different now from the Reagan administration is of course that the Dobbs decision happened. So states have the ability, as you know, and you've been talking about, to put in place their own laws, and we've seen the impact of those. So when Trump or JD Vance or whomever it may be says it should go back to the states, well, we see how that goes. What it means is we have a country where half the states have restrictive laws that could lead to deaths in some cases, women having sepsis, doctors being prosecuted, and half the states that don't. And that's what's also different.
But why didn't that resonate with more people? I mean, which brings me back to sort of the information ecosystem.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is so fragmented. You can create your own digital diet or media diet. And, I heard so many people saying, well, it's fine to let the states decide, as if the people of those states would be in a position, well, they were in some cases, right, with the referenda that were, voted on this go round, but somehow these stories did not penetrate or did not get through a lot of voters about the dangers of leaving it to states who would prohibit abortion even in cases of rape, incest, or when the mother's life is in danger. There are states like that out there, right, Jen?
100%. Now, I think, I have some answers. I don't have but I'll just be, like, humble about the place I don't have answers, and this is a place
Yeah.
where I feel like I need to do more studying and understanding is the disinformation space. I do think that unquestionably to me, you know, one of the things that's changed even since I got involved in politics is just the rise of the percentage of people who get their information off of platforms that have no fact checking mechanism and no accountability for having disinformation spread, right?
Right.
And as you know well, and I mean, when I got started in Democratic politics, most of it was like local TV ads. That was what it was about. Obviously, national TV, local print, those local TV is held to a higher standard of accountability than social media platforms in terms of having accurate information on their platforms. That is crazy. And so it is how does it change? How are people held to account? Laws have to change. I don't even know the total answer to it, but that seems to me to be a core issue. The other issue I think that is a real one is I don't think Joe Rogan deserves, like, 100% credit of of Donald Trump being elected, but it was a misunderstanding of kind of also the how people are getting their information and an undervaluing of some of those platforms that Trump was doing that either don't really exist on the other side or, don't
Not
exist
in
in the
those
same
numbers
powerful
anyway.
not in the numbers. Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, again, my head is swimming with so many with so many things that I've been trying to process over the last few days. There's this whole theory about a huge backlash by young men and some older men, and perhaps that explains some of the Latino vote to this idea that women are making so many more strides. I mean, ostensibly, you look at medical schools and law schools, and that, there was Me Too, there was Black Lives Matter, and suddenly I think, the end of I think people were still angry about affirmative action when it was in place, and they're sort of like, I thought this country was a meritocracy, and now I'm feeling screwed.
Yeah. And I think the feeling screwed takes many forms, right? And maybe people who it is sexism for wouldn't even admit to themselves that it's sexism, right?
I
Because
think
you
that's so
it's like
right, Jen. I
it's
think
like
that some people don't even recognize their implicit bias. I have a friend who said, I'm just worried that Kamala Harris doesn't have the stature to deal with world leaders. And I thought, wow, this was a very successful woman. And I thought, maybe just replace stature with penis.
yeah.
I was so, honestly, so
Do we need
flummoxed by
t-shirts
that
that say that?
statement.
Maybe replace stature with penis? Get them made out there. It's like yeah,
But
yeah.
it was so perplexing to me, and I was like, "Oh, this is someone who doesn't realize her deep-seated implicit bias against female leadership."
Yes, and that is of it's so hard to measure because people don't even admit it to themselves.
Right.
And it is I mean, in my on the Latino men part of this, which I think there's not one answer for, but
I agree, and I think we have to be careful, stratifying
yes,
society in the way we do with polls. I
yes,
think Mike Murphy I heard John Heilman say this on Bill Maher, so I'm quoting a quote of a quote, but Mike Murphy said, "When are we gonna just call Latino men men?" I mean, it almost underscores or exacerbates this notion of identity politics,
yeah,
right?
yes, yes, and I think, it depends on, also, like, no group is monolithic. Women are not
Right.
monolithic. Clearly, white women are not monolithic, but Latino men are not monolithic either. And the things that Latino men in Florida might be grappling with, including like this notion of socialism and communism and what it means if you came from a country where that was a dominant issue.
Like
Also the
Cuba.
right, in Cuba, and also the, Christina Londano, I'm gonna quote someone now who sits next to me. She's a Telemundo longtime Telemundo reporter, and I had dinner with her maybe 3 nights before the election, and she said to me something that stuck with me, which is, like, sometimes the issues that Democrats think are gonna work their that for them, like democracy and abortion rights, work the reverse way among some because there's sometimes more conservative social values. Anyway, it's my point is there's not a monolithic take here. I've also in my kind of research studying phase of this, because this is my coping mechanism,
Yeah,
I've been
me
reading,
too.
Paulo Ramos's book, which is basically about, it's called The Defectors, and it's about, the Latino men who have become MAGA and why. Now, it's not she's very humble in the book, but it's not conclusive, but part of it, she talks about identity and identifying as an American versus identifying as an immigrant. And that's an interesting part of the conversation too, but I don't know the total answer, but I think it's one that is worth everyone continuing to learn and explore and listen more about.
I think that's true because I think often these pundits make these pronouncements,
Yeah.
right? That
Yes.
are too general, that treat communities as monolithic
Yeah.
and not as separate people, separate, even individual people and
People,
families,
humans,
right?
yeah.
Who have had very different experiences, as you said, certainly within the Latino community. What do you think about all the finger pointing at wokeness? Now, first of all, I hate that word, and I feel like it's been a bit overstated, but there does seem to be an increasing intolerance for being told how you're supposed to think and being told you're less than because you don't think a certain way.
I think that's it for me. And again, but how I've thought about it is nobody likes to be condescended to or told that they have to hit a certain litmus test of things to be welcomed and invited in the party. And I think sometimes people feel that way about the Democratic Party. What
I
I
think they feel like they weren't invited to the cool kids table.
Yeah. Yes, yes, and I think, though, what I'm not sure about, because 'cause I've also heard a lot of people make this pronouncement, Trump had this, I do think that some of the positions that Vice President Harris took when she was running for president in 2019, which I actually don't think are her positions, because they weren't before and they weren't after, and there's an inauthenticity to that 6 months of her life, right? But which is a lesson for lots of people running for office, be authentic to what you believe, but,
Yeah, my sister used to say, I don't know if you knew, my sister was running for
yes,
lieutenant governor
yes.
with, I think you and I have talked about this with Mark Warner, and then she got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and had to drop out, sadly, tragically. And Emily used to say to me, when you run for office, you have to be willing to lose. And I
Yeah.
think what she meant is you have got to adhere to your core values, who you are as a person, and if you lose, then you're not meant to win. And
Mhm.
and I so respected that. And I think it speaks to, as you were saying, the 2019 positions. But can I just add something, Jen? Because I wonder if you've also thought about this. It seems to me, people kind of forget that moment in time, too. I
Mm.
mean, it was sort of right on the heels of Me Too, right on the heels of Black Lives Matter. I think there were forces
Mhm.
that were pulling everybody, and I don't want it necessarily to say to the left, but maybe it was to the left, but, this kind of realization, this feeling that, if you're a white American, you're to blame,
Mhm.
and there's something wrong with you, and that you're part of the problem, and the whole Karen thing and all that just sort of, I wonder if her positions were in a way informed by that environment that we were experiencing, and that this election in a way was a repudiation of, or an expression of some of those feelings. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, look, I think there is a, huge swath of the population, voters, I should say, who didn't feel heard or connected with the Democratic Party messaging and the top of the ticket. And that is not, it's a divided country, all the things, but there are policy issues that should be helpful to the very same people who voted against the Democratic Party platform and ticket, right? Including advocacy for a minimum wage, including, like, raising taxes on the highest income in corporate America. So that disconnect tells you it's about something bigger, right? It's about feeling left out of the party, not feeling heard, feeling ignored. There are lots of, things that could be the reasoning for it, but yes, I do think that is certainly a part of it. I also think there have been some major shifts in sort of, and immigration is one of them. And this is where I'm kind of like, my personal views aside, you'd have to put them aside when you're looking at the political spectrum, right? Immigration and the country has become increasingly conservative on that issue, right? And I look at even the bipartisan border bill that didn't move forward. That was an incredibly conservative bill.
I know, I wish they had made a point of how Trump convinced Republicans not to even vote on it because it would weaken his ability to weaponize
I know.
immigration. It
They
made me
tried.
so mad.
I may, yes. They tried. It always felt like a hard message to me, not in a fair way, but because you're explaining, like, how he prevented a legislative process from moving forward. But what stuck out to me about that bill is I think only 5 or 6 Democratic senators voted against it. I think it would have been 20 or 25 a couple of years ago. So to your point about where kind of the shifts have been, that's one of the areas. And remember that same 2019 primary was when nearly everybody on stage raised their hand that they would decriminalize border crossings, right? The politics on that have changed a lot, and that is kind of, and I think it is also related to feeling ignored, left behind, by a broad swath of working class America. That's part of it too.
I think it might be reflected by, what was mostly derided by some of those border states and governors in terms of taking some of these immigrants and putting them on planes and sending them to New York City and sending them to other areas around the world. And I remember I have a friend who's pretty conservative who lives in Florida. And I said, "What do you think of that?" And she said, "I thought it was great." And I
Yep.
think the point is that, listen, we can't have completely porous borders, right? There has to be some system for immigration. And I think one of the other things that was undercovered was the strain on social services
Mhm.
that a huge influx of, and now of course it's not they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats situation in that gross, you know, um, bigoted way.
Mhm.
But there is a genuine concern for, I think, a lot of these communities that can't absorb the number of people who are coming in. And it can lead to more homelessness, as you know, and I think it can strain school systems and hospitals. So, I would have liked to have seen that story be told. And and then talk to the candidates about like what should be done. And along those lines, since you were in the Biden administration, why didn't they do more? And why, when he was elected, Jen, was there almost a reversal of like almost a come on in? Well, at least this is my impression, and you can correct the record if I'm wrong. You know, sort of this overreaction to the build the wall rhetoric that led to too big of an influx of immigrants, getting rid of the remain in Mexico policy and all those things. So was that kind of an FU to Trump? And in retrospect, was that not the right thing to do?
Well, so a lot of things on this.
Yeah.
I think, sort of everybody's at fault in Washington in some ways because immigration is such a politically charged issue that people are unwilling to compromise on it and have real negotiations and discussions about it. I mean, Biden proposed an immigration bill that included increased border security and a more humane asylum processing the first day, right?
Right,
No
right.
one would discuss it. No one would come to the White House and meet with him about it. That I'm not saying that he's blameless. I'm just saying, like,
Right,
that tells
right,
you a
and
lot about the politics.
she often brought that up during the campaign.
Yeah, that is true. What is also true is that because the COVID restrictions were in place for so long, that was in many ways artificially keeping the numbers lower,
Right.
until they were flipped back. And then during that period of time, there was the negotiation with Mexico about re-implementing the Remain in Mexico program, which was there was a lot of criticism of, and a lot of people who hated that, especially from the left. So, um, I think there was a delayed reaction to where clearly the country was moving on immigration, by I don't actually not really Joe Biden, but a lot of people in the system, in the Democratic Party, within the caucuses, and it wasn't very clear to me that it had moved massively until that bipartisan border bill. And so yes, hindsight's always 2020, but I think looking now, there are aspects of how the party should proceed from here, which I think this election should be partly informative about, including acknowledging that the border and having a secure border is a part of what the Democratic Party messaging needs to be proactively, you know?
Yeah, on the other hand, though, I think we should point out how Donald Trump and the party exploited the immigration issue with false information
Yes.
about the crimes that were committed and really misrepresented the fact that actually immigrants commit fewer crimes than native born
Yes.
citizens in this country. But I think it just got so twisted and exploited, and the fear and fentanyl and all that stuff, I think it got mixed up in one big bowl and made people just terrified. And to the point where for a lot of Americans, rounding up people and having a mass deportation of 13 million immigrants sounded like a good idea.
Which is, wrapping my head around that particular conclusion is one that's been a very perplexing one to grapple. I mean, when you also listen to focus groups and things, people will when they learn more about it, they don't love it, right?
Right.
So which is a relief, I suppose, but, I think I'm glad you brought that up, and I think that the pieces of this is a perfect disinformation example, right?
Mhm.
I mean, actually, the border numbers have been down over the last couple of months,
And I
for a range
even
of
looked
reasons.
up last night, about, crimes, the crime rate among the immigrant population, and I thought I would see what I saw with my own eyes, but that it was just incredibly and cruelly manipulated by the Trump campaign to a point that it was really grotesque.
Yeah, as has crime numbers in major cities, which is not where actually crime has gone up. And there is also we are still the United States of America, where we are a country of immigrants, right? There is still a humanity side of this that
I
I
know,
think.
but it's really it's perplexing and disturbing that, I saw something on social media. You might have seen it too, Jen, because I have a feeling we're probably fed the same
We might be.
content. But it was, I think it was an Asian comedian who was interviewing a white guy, probably in his 60s, at a Chinese restaurant. And the guy basically said, I don't want the white race to be replaced. I mean, it was sort of white nationalist rhetoric that has been somewhat normalized. And I did a documentary series for Nat Geo in 2018, and one of the subjects was white anxiety. And I think there are a lot of people when you think of the fact that there is going to be a majority minority population by 2044 in this country really feel like that white that as a white American, I'm losing my place in this country. And I don't think people are excited, or a lot of people are not excited about a pluralistic society
Yeah,
in this group, and it just breaks my heart.
it breaks my heart too. It is where the country has been headed for some time, right? There is the left behind aspect of this, which there's lots of reasons for, but social media is one of them, right? Where people are looking at social media and thinking everybody has it better than me, right? And that includes, I think, a lot of communities where the factory where their grandparents worked
Right.
no longer is the factory that's driving an amazing life, right?
Oh, no,
Where
totally. I talked to somebody in Nebraska about this who worked at a meat packing plant, and he was
Mhm.
paid, a good salary where he could raise his kids and have a middle class life in this small rural town in Nebraska. And then unions started losing power. The companies started importing lower wage workers
Mhm.
in from Mexico and other countries. And then another guy I talked to in Nebraska was like, they're doing jobs that a lot of Americans don't wanna do. They don't wanna work in a meat processing plant,
Mhm.
and a lot of the employees who are immigrants are grateful to be able to, have a full-time steady job. So it's so complex, isn't it, Jen?
It is incredibly complex. I think lots of different communities see this differently. The business community obviously sees this differently from people in communities that have changed massively. Even the communities that have changed massively, a lot of people in those communities may not want to do those jobs. To your point, there's also issues that which I think we're going to see. Not exact replication, I hope not, but some of. I mean, the person who Trump just named to be his border czar is the person who is responsible for family separations. So is that what people want?
Well, did you hear that guy on the podcast? I forget his name, who said, "Yeah, we're gonna round up, we're gonna deport grandmothers, we're
Yep.
gonna deport wives and husbands, we're gonna put children in cages. It's going to be glorious." And I think this is somebody who is being considered for attorney general. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Oh, yes. Mike Davis? Am I thinking of
Yes.
the right person?
Yes.
And the guy I'm talking about is Holman, I think who was announced as the border czar, who basically has said governors, others who if you try to resist me, will come double our numbers of law enforcement who come to your state, who's talked about re-implementing workplace raids. Is that what people want in these communities? I think we'll see, and I don't wish that upon any community, but I do think that we're gonna see in the coming months what people voted for.
What do you think about people, speaking of that, like Gavin Newsom and Governor Pritzker, trying to figure out ways to protect their states from certain policies that the Trump administration wants to enact?
I think that is gonna be one to me, it's one of the most interesting spaces to watch. As much as I think many of the people who voted for Kamala Harris and millions of Democrats, independents out there feel very lost, forlorn, looking for property in Canada, whatever they're doing right
Well,
now.
I think especially because the guardrails have
Yes.
disappeared, with the House, the Senate, judiciary, the
Yes.
executive branch. It's like, fuck me. What are we supposed to do?
Exactly. So
Excuse my French, everyone.
it's all right. Don't worry. Yes, so to me, it is interesting for 2 reasons. One is that to me is one of the guardrails, is governors in these states who are already conveying they're going to push back. Maura Healey in Massachusetts, it's another one of them.
But isn't
Um,
that dangerous on one level? I mean, it takes a lot of chutzpah to do that, because I know Kathy Hochul got on the phone with Donald Trump, and, you know, that isn't without risks in terms of what retribution he
yes,
could level at certain states, right?
that's true, but I think these governors are showing who's got the chutzpah, right? And who is going to do everything they can to lead and protect to the best of their ability, the people in their states. I also think it's interesting because right now there's no leader of the Democratic Party. Um, and that is a vacuum, but a good one because people are going to emerge, right? I don't know who they are. We'll see. But some of them, maybe some of these governors who push back. We'll
Well,
see.
yeah, well, I mean, Gavin Newsom, what a surprise. I mean, has national ambitions, but other
Right.
than
We're tracking that. But
other than Gavin Newsom, and I guess, why can't I remember Governor Pritzker's first name?
JB,
JB, that's right. That's why I can't remember. It's
yeah,
initials.
it's two word.
JB
Yeah.
Pritzker, and who are some of the people, Jen, you're going to be keeping an eye on in terms of rising stars? We wanted to
Yeah.
do a whole series with and it kind of fell apart, but I thought it would have been so smart to say, everyone's bemoaning the fact that there aren't enough leaders, and I wanted to say, well, here's some people who are doing great things. Keep your eye on these folks, but it didn't come together.
Well, I
But you
hope you still do that. We're
you
starting to
should
do
do it.
that.
You should
We're
do it,
doing it.
Jen.
We're doing it. I mean, we just had, I think there are a lot of governors, but I also will say, and I'll come back to them in a second. We just had the new mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma on yesterday, and first African American mayor in that city's history, given the history of Tulsa.
Yes, yes.
Pretty remarkable. Young guy, so compelling and interesting. We also had Justin Jones and Mallory McMorrow on. Are those people all going to be president in four
I don't
years?
know who
No.
Justin Jones and
He
Mallory
is
are.
so here now I'm gonna tell you. So Justin Jones is a state rep in Tennessee. He was one of the Tennessee 3
Oh,
who
I
really
know. Oh, I know of him. I have a friend from college who's working for him, and I think he was in New York, and she wanted me to come to some event, and I couldn't come. I know who you're talking about.
he's right, he is incredibly compelling and powerful and has been fearless in fighting for issues he believes in a red state. Mallory McMorrow, you should check her out on Instagram because she's been answering reader questions or viewer questions, hard ones. She's she's a state senator in Michigan. She ran in 2018 after Trump won in 2016. And I talked to them because I think it is important for people to see new faces and different faces and inspiring faces and people who are fighting back. There were a number of people who won in states that Trump won. I mean, including re-election. Tammy Baldwin won re-election
Right?
in Nevada. Jackie Rosen won re-election. Alyssa Slotkin is a new senator from Michigan. There are now 2 Black women who are senators. Those were not Trump won states, but still inspiring. But in terms of rising stars, some of it is we don't entirely know yet. And what's cool about democracy is we don't actually pick, you and I, as much as we've done this for a long
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
But some of the people I think will be interesting to watch. I mean, obviously Newsom, Pritzker, Moore,
Wes Moore is the
Wes
governor of
Moore,
Maryland,
governor of
everybody, and
Maryland,
very
um,
inspiring life story, very charismatic guy.
very yeah, he did a full University of Maryland football practice. That's not the most important thing, but, an
Yeah.
interesting thing, and shotgun a beer for people who think that's compelling, some will. Um, Obviously, Governor Shapiro, but I think it could be beyond that, you know? I think there's mayors who are interesting, there are younger state, members of Congress who are interesting, and I think it's just gonna be interesting to see who rises, because the vacuum means people rise. Some rise who you don't know of, some rise and fail who you think are gonna be the next thing, and that's what's interesting about this moment.
And some come out of nowhere, like Jimmy Carter out of Plains, Georgia, like, who knew, right?
Who knew? And in some ways, differently, but, Barack Obama, I mean, he had given that speech in 2004
Right.
when Kerry lost, but, like, nobody thought he was gonna be the nominee. No one thought he would have a chance of winning. He did 4 years later, so we'll see.
How do you think Joe Biden is feeling right now?
Oh, um, I have not spoken with him, and not that you were asking me that, but just for clarity for your listeners. I think, sad. And probably pretty dark about this moment.
Do
He
you think he
obviously
feels at all responsible?
I don't know if that's where his head is at. I really don't know. I think he probably looks at where working class voters were and wonders if he the party, I'm not sure, Harris should have been doing something differently and better. I mean, his I always think about, a lot of some of the conversations I had with him when I was the press secretary, where he would always tell me, "That's not how people talk," right? There'd be language that was spit out of the bureaucratic system, and he'd say, like, "Nobody talks like that in Scranton, Pennsylvania." Now, I'm not suggesting I think Harris did far better than he would have done had he remained the nominee, so I'm not suggesting that. I do think that he probably has a mixture of emotions right now about how the party communicated, about I don't know if it's the timing of when he dropped out. I don't know if he thinks he could have done better. I don't know what's going on in his head right
I
now.
think he's probably wondering about his legacy too,
His
you know?
legacy, I think, is the biggest thing. And this is I remember I was working for President Obama when Trump won, and I was his communications director, and the first 24 to 48 hours was really more on a very personal, visceral level for people in the building. What does this mean for them? And I'm not trying to be cheesy about it, but people really were like, "I'm a Muslim American. Like, what does this mean for me? From the LGBTQ plus community. What does this mean for me? I am." It was very personal. That was what everybody was dealing. We weren't thinking about the legacy. It quickly moved there, though, to a point where we thought that it felt like so many people in the country knew that Trump was racist and sexist and just looked the other way, and it felt, disappointing, right? Not in individuals, but felt like maybe we haven't made as much progress as a country as we thought we had, and I think for Biden, he just worked for 8 years as vice president, 4 years in between, 4 years more as president, worked to make progress on a lot of things that he has the right to be proud of.
I feel
And
like
it's
that
like
could have been, and, I'm telling the press secretary, but I do think, Jen, maybe they weren't up to speed on the way people get information either. I think, President Biden, and please disagree with me if you don't think this is the case, but, and everything is hindsight is 2020, but I feel like they were kind of operating a 2020 press organization in a 1990 kind of way. I think they were slow to understand the power of social media.
Mhm.
I think, they were still showing up on Meet the Press and thinking that was really gonna have an impact, and I respect Meet the Press, and, I'm not putting down legacy media, but it seems like, there was this almost head in the sand idea, or kind of resorting to the same old that did not serve them well, where they weren't really able to explain their accomplishments, that they didn't kind of talk where all these, people are getting information
Mhm.
on in all these fragmented ways. I think they were kind of slow to pick that up. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I agree with some of it and not some of it. So I think, one, they definitely weren't doing Meet the Press. You can ask the people doing
Oh,
Meet
yeah.
the Press
Yeah,
about how
you're
angry
probably
they are
right, but,
about.
when they would do something,
Yes,
and
yes,
by
yes.
the way, I wanna ask you about that too, go on.
Okay, okay. I said, so you can ask them. They would tell you they never engage with them. Um, I think there are people on the team, including there's a guy named Rob Flaherty who ran the digital team for Biden and continued with Harris, who I think is you don't really have money on the campaign, you don't have it in the White House, who built very large followings and to the best of his ability within his constraints and his team did really amazing
Well, I
things.
thought the Harris campaign was doing an awesome job.
Same people.
I'm talking about the Biden administration.
Same people doing the
Oh,
stuff.
did they just not have any money?
You don't have money in the White House for any of it. So you
Yeah.
have it on a campaign. I also, though, think that there has to be candidates who have the agility to do those things, right? And, um, and I don't know that anybody who was at a certain age has that real agility, right?
Well,
It's just
Kamala
not.
Harris did.
She's younger than,
Right, right, but I still think you
but
can
I
do it
also don't
without
think
the
as much as she
candidate,
did,
Jen.
like Brad Summer, which was cool, didn't work. Young people
Yeah.
didn't turn out. So, like, I think there's also, like, a lot of things about that they can control and things they can't, including there isn't the same ecosystem on the left, including you need to have people who are willing to do a range of things. And yes, she was willing to do a lot of things, not all of the things, but a range of
Although there was
things.
that 3-week blackout period, which I honestly could not understand, that was making me
I
crazy just
I
from a
didn't
consumer.
understand. I also
Why
don't.
what was that?
I think I don't know. I think maybe a focus on the debate and the debate being a moment where, but let's just be real, debates are important for the American people. They do not, this is also like an outdated view of like how elections will turn, in my view.
I
You
think
should
she
do
should
them,
have been
yes,
everywhere, everywhere.
but also Tim Walz, who was this kind of like so appealing, rough around the edges guy during Veep stakes, where he propelled himself onto the ticket essentially, and then he disappeared from public view for like
Yeah,
4 months. I don't think it would have changed the outcome. I think there's like lots of factors as
right.
far as I've digested it, but it is a you have to be fearless in how you communicate and who and what formats you communicate on. And that means doing all of the things, including with people you disagree with who are going to be tough. I actually thought one of her better interviews was with Brett Baer. Like she liked being on, having a tough interview, you know? So I
I
think that's
always
part of the
find that
lesson.
people do better
Yeah.
when they're asked really challenging, pointed questions. I always
Yeah.
felt that about Hillary Clinton. If you are giving them these almost weird, like amorphous softballs,
Yeah.
it's really hard to kind of hone your message and be succinct and say what you really need to say. But listen, I also felt that, and again, I think she really did well in so many areas, and
Mhm.
but I was frustrated by her inability to really succinctly answer questions at times, Jen, and to kind of like if she was asked about changing the Supreme Court at that CNN town
Yeah.
hall, she had an opportunity to talk about ethics and what Alito and Clarence Thomas were doing. And she answered like in one sentence and then like went on to something that had nothing to do with the question. People notice that. And it's like, answer the goddamn question, please.
I mean, yeah, I love this. I'm seeing the Katie Couric I watched on TV for so many years, and I'm
Well,
so
I
here
don't
for
never
it.
say goddamn, right?
I know, but you thought it.
Yeah.
This is my kind of like unsolicited advice to every person who may run for president, and I'm not picking any ponies. Whatever pony emerges, emerge. Sit down and think about why are you running for president, right? What is the most driving important thing for you so you can answer that question. And then explore what you actually think about the hard questions of the day. It doesn't have to be what's poll tested. In fact, ignore that. What do you think should happen on immigration? What do you think should happen in Israel? Every one of them should be able to for themselves answer those questions. And this is the time to do that right now. Explore those things, learn more about areas you don't know, and form your own opinion.
Well, one of the most damaging things was when she did go on The View, and they made hay over this, and when she said, I really can't think of a single thing she'd do differently than Joe Biden." Do you think they were first of all, okay, Jen, you're an insider. Why didn't Joe Biden say, "Listen, I know you're gonna have to separate yourself from this administration. Let's talk about areas where you can, where they're legitimate, and Godspeed." Because I think somebody wrote that it was almost as if they were more afraid of hurting Joe Biden's feelings than winning the election. Okay, help me out here, Jen.
I wish that would have happened. I don't know that it didn't, but I think we can all assume it didn't, right? And I
You
think
mean
it was
the come to Jesus
that
with Joe and
conversation that you just
Kamala. Yeah.
described, because I've worked for a lot of people in different circumstances. I mean, this was an incredibly, I'm not making this as an excuse, but unique and painful summer for Joe Biden, for everybody around him, for major leaders of the Democratic Party who he'll probably never speak to again, like Nancy Pelosi. And there was a fragility. There was also, what's also true, and I think this may have been weighed the wrong way, is that when Joe Biden made the decision he did, for good reason, he was beloved by the Democratic Party, and I think in her mind, there's a she navigated the politics of that in a very tricky way, right?
Right.
So, I don't know, I think that answer on The View was not was one of the wor she had many moments of brilliance, that was not one of them.
Well, why couldn't I mean, it seems to me if I were running for president, Jen, I would sit down with my, brain trust and I'd be like, "Okay, let's let's play out these questions. What am I going to say to
Yep.
this?" And I would have had a template that I would have carried around with me in every interview, and I would have reviewed them and said, you know, "This is what I believe and this is how I'm going to handle a question like that." Now, what why didn't they it just didn't seem like that was done. Am I crazy?
Well, we don't know, And here's the thing. Looking at the first Biden debate, this is a different thing, but I've prepped a lot of people who you know what they should say, and then they ignore your advice. So I don't know if that happened and, like, she just in the moment felt like she should just not differentiate. She kind of over the course of time, she started differentiating herself, but it was a little bit on the margins, right?
Right.
And, it wasn't something I think people could bite into. Now, she also had some challenges any sitting vice president has, say on Gaza, right? Which is like, I actually don't know what her view is on that issue. I don't know, but she's the sitting vice president. She can't come out with a massively different position than the sitting president while national security people and diplomats are negotiating a deal. She was kinda stuck on that, right?
Right.
Um, so
But
I
there
don't
was
know.
this impression, I guess, and I guess because of the, what were the accords called that Jared Kushner helped, the Abraham
Yeah,
Accords,
mhm.
and moving the
Embassy,
embassy,
yeah.
right? I mean, so there was this, I think, pre-baked feeling, on the part of some voters that Donald Trump was gonna be much stronger for Israel, and I think when she expressed and which I think is so sad, the inability to think dialectically and say yes and is just been lost in this country, but I
Mhm.
think when she expressed even sympathy for people who had, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I think a lot of people interpreted that as not being strong enough for Israel.
Yes. And the politics, I mean, the humanity of the issue, as you just touched on, is the humanity of the issue. There's also, of course, families that lost loved ones who were killed by Hamas. All is true.
Of course,
All is
yes.
true. I know I'm not saying, but all is true. I think for her, the politics of it were such that before she became the nominee, there was a feeling that the Democratic Party, by some Jewish Americans, not all, was aligning themselves or not doing enough to push back on anti-Semitism, right? You saw that in focus groups a lot. I don't think that
Right,
was talked about enough as a real issue. And then you also had young people, communities of color, obviously college campuses who felt there was an ignoring of the humanitarian tragedies in God. Both were happening at the same time, and Trump somehow skirted it, right? And his view, and we'll see if this is what he implements, is that Netanyahu should get to do whatever he wants and should plow forward and level Gaza, and, like, that's all fine.
And, I talked to a friend of mine who said her daughter went to this Ivy League school, and a lot of her friends didn't vote to send a message to Kamala Harris about Gaza.
What they voted by not voting, they essentially voted to elect Donald Trump, whose position is Gaza who, Gaza what, Netanyahu, who, by the way, many Jewish Americans and people in Israel do not like, right?
Right.
And so he's saying, "Give him free pass." Um, that it does not make a lot of sense to
I
me.
just yeah, it just seems like by not voting, they were giving the election to somebody who, as you said, is going to be, is not going to even listen to their concerns
Yeah,
about what is going on.
yeah,
And one last question,
sure.
Jen, just because I have you here. I was talking to my team today about how trans people were really used and exploited like immigrants in this election, and that there was so much misinformation about, um, you know, what happens to somebody who feels trapped in the wrong body, and this whole idea of gender
Mhm.
affirmation or confirmation surgery happening and people getting things chopped off and all this kind of gross language. And did the Harris campaign react enough to that ad about prisoners, about approving taxpayer money so prisoners could get gender confirmation surgery? They changed it to, she cares about they, them, and he cares about you type thing. What's your take on all of that? I know I just threw out a ton of
No,
stuff
no, no,
at
no,
you.
sure. I mean, this is a part one where I feel very frustrated by some people's knee-jerk reactions where they say, like, "Democrats should stop talking about trans people." You're like, "Well, okay." But there are people, to your point, who feel they many people who were feel they were born in the wrong body, and there's, huge mental health crises with young people, who are trans and young adults, and that is a real issue, and I don't think the Democratic Party or people who believe that should run away from that because they're reading into this particular reaction to the ad. Now, the ad was related to a 2019 position she took that she since backed away from, right? How many people has that applied to? Yeah.
4 people. 4
Yes.
people.
And I wish that somebody would have screamed that from the rooftops, right? I also think there is a suf I I don't think I'm naive in this. I think people are smart. I'm not saying it would have won her the election, but people can be sophisticated, right? You can tell people no one is changing the gender of your child when they go to school. That is not an actual thing, right? Also, should we be discussing funding with taxpayer dollars gender affirming care for prisoners? I don't know, maybe that's something that should be rediscussed. There are so many layers of this issue. What I don't wanna see, I remember back at post 2004, you remember how there was about a dozen states, I think it was 11 states, that had, gay marriage ballot initiatives that helped
Mhm.
Bush win, right? And after that, a lot of the conclusion among Democratic candidates was, "Well, we can't talk about gay marriage. That's a non-starter, even if people believed it." And I just don't wanna see that happen because I think that would be just moving away from what's morally right, in my view.
Can you explain why his behavior, his language, his coarseness and crudeness, why why a lot of people seem to like that? I mean, every time I'd hear him say something, and I guess maybe again it's a backlash to quote unquote wokeness or political correctness. It's part of that. But like when I saw him like pretending to give the mic a blowjob, I was like, "Oh my god." And then other people, like I looked at the people in the background and I was like, They were laughing. I have does it just not matter how somebody comports themselves in our society anymore? Maybe we're just like, I don't know, are we out of step?
I mean, I don't think of myself as prude in any way, shape, or form. I can talk about all the things, but the crudeness, I guess, I think maybe people find funny. And maybe the talking about sharks and electrocuting and whatever that craziness people find funny. What I do have a hard time understanding is the cruelty
Mm.
and why that is okay. Because I don't know, I don't think of myself as naive. I generally think of people, most human beings, as being kind, right? And rooting for other humans, and, the things he says when he talks about Hannibal Lecter, I'm like, "That is weird and creepy," but some people, maybe they find that funny, I don't know. But the cruelty is what I don't have an answer for, and I can't really understand.
So many people asked if the Democrats were going to ask for a recount and why there are 20 million votes missing. I want to make sure everyone knows that there's been no evidence of voter fraud. And the reason there are fewer votes is because there was a lower turnout this year compared to 2020. But are you hearing that from a lot of your fellow Democrats or a lot of your viewers, Jen?
I hear that a lot on social media platforms, like people who and those are valid voices, of course, too, but, like, people who are replying and asking questions like that and not understanding, to your point, there was a lower turnout, and also there were still, at least there have been, and there still are today, votes being counted in California, which is always the case, but people forget that it takes a couple more weeks because of how California takes a while to count their votes. That's another topic for another podcast on why it takes so long. And but there are laws in states that trigger recounts if it is too close, right? If it is within a margin. So I have heard that, but I think it's important for people to understand that the margins of victory were quite large in a lot of places, definitive, and that there were fewer people that turned out for Kamala Harris than turned out for Joe Biden. And there are a range of reasons for that. It was easier to vote 4 years ago. Trump was in their face. He was the sitting president. There are lots of things, as we've been discussing, but that's also just a reality of where things sit right now.
And looking forward, Jen, I know these are not your people, but we've heard names that will be occupying very important roles in a future Trump administration. Susie Wiles, who was so important to the Trump campaign, Elise Stefanik, ambassador to the UN, Stephen Miller, deputy chief of staff, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Director. You mentioned Tom Homan. Uh, he said Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo will not have a role, but obviously RFK Jr. and Elon Musk are going to be pretty front and center in a Trump administration. So, you know, this is the MAGA takeover of the US. What do you expect of this new regime, if you will? Maybe regime is the right
Right.
word.
Um I will there are people. Elise Stefanik was once kind of a rising star, moderate member of Congress, and she became full MAGA. I have not thought enough about what that means for her role as a UN ambassador, although she has been a person who has been an eager advocate of Trump's position on let Netanyahu do whatever Netanyahu wants. But I think the 2 that stick out to me there the most are that I've just been thinking about today are Stephen Miller and Tom Homan. Am I getting his name right? Homan
Yes,
or
it is
Holman?
Homan. It is Homan. At
It's,
least that's what we have as well.
in part okay, we're all getting to know them, that's what this is evidence of. In part because there's Trump loyalists returning, and loyalists to a greater degree than even we saw 8 years ago. Now, to be fair, every president hires people who supports them,
Right.
who are like, you are grateful to be there. This is a different level of that, though, because these are people who have
This is
shown they're
fealty.
You're right, they're not going to question. The other thing that has stuck out to me, and now we're gonna use this in the show tonight, but is Stephen Miller did this interview after in, like, 2017, I think it was, where he talked about the perception or his view of power, right, and executive power. And a lot of these people, those 2 specifically, who will be in charge, play big roles on, mass deportations and immigration policy, view executive power, the power of the presidency, as all powerful and bigger than any other power. And that is the part that I think will be quite telling. You've seen, like, Tom Homan basically has said, for states that push back, I'm gonna double up, the number of people who come into their states and enforce. So, I don't know how that manifests itself, but Trump's view of his own power, of executive power, obviously he doesn't view equal branches of power, and how the people who he's hired view that, I think is gonna be part of the story we see in the first at least one I'll be watching.
Yeah, it's almost as if Stephen Miller is Donald Trump's new Roy Cohn.
Yeah. Yes. Um, one who has quite a view of white supremacy in the world.
Before we go, I've said that 1,200 times, but before we go, Jen, I wanna end on a hopeful note. Um, you have talked about the need for hope
Mm,
and despite everything, and the fear that a lot of people have. Let's be honest, there are people listening to this who are very excited about what's to come.
mhm,
Um, Maybe not every aspect, and maybe
mhm.
they'll be surprised. I guess it remains to be seen how much of Project 2025 will actually be implemented, if he is going to get rid of the Department of Education, the National Weather Service, gut the civil service and basically replace those workers with people who pledge fealty to Donald Trump. Okay, having said that, you have said there's reason to not feel powerless because I think given all the factors, people are like, "Well, what am I supposed to do?"
Yep.
And I watched you, either it was on your show, I think I saw it on Instagram actually, which is where I get a lot of my
Same,
information.
there we go, like America, Katie.
Yeah, where you talked about the the sort of ebb and flow of political power and how things change. So I thought maybe we'd end with you kind of talking about how history can be our guide on this.
Yeah, and I will just reiterate one quick thing you said, which is, I mean, I'm not trying to be, and I said this, I think, in the video or whatever it may have been, naive
Or
about
Pollyanna, you said.
Pollyanna-ish
Yeah.
about what Trump says he wants to do, and he will be successful in doing some of it, at least. We'll see, we don't know yet. But I think there is an ebb and flow of history, and, I worked on the Kerry campaign in 2004, which obviously he lost to George W. Bush, and George W. Bush had brought the country into the war in Iraq, something that was quite unpopular, that John Kerry had been a decorated war veteran who ran against him, speaking out against that. And on paper, it felt like he would be the right person to defeat him, and he obviously didn't. And it opened up this period of time, and you remember this well, I'm sure, where there was a lot of speculation, not in a partisan way, certainly Republicans, but Democrats too, that maybe it was forever the Republican Party. Maybe the Republican Party and the party of Bush was the party of the foreseeable future. And it wasn't. In part because when you're in office and you're governing, you're held to a different account. And in many ways, the country always looks for change and wants to hold to account the people who are in power. And that is a part of the story of 2024, too. 2 years later, of course, the Democrats won back the House for the first time in over a decade. Nancy Pelosi became the first Speaker of the House. And 2 years after that, a guy with the middle name Hussein was elected to the presidency. Someone who was not the establishment candidate. And no most people wouldn't have predicted. I mean, people thought he was like a rising star, but I don't think people would have predicted he would have been the nominee. So I share that because this is different. Trump is different. George W. Bush, who obviously didn't vote for it, looks pretty great these days, to me.
Yeah.
But but there are cyclical things. Accountability is a thing. People do have power. I also talked about how the Affordable Care Act was something Trump ran planning to get rid of. And because of activism, because people showed up at events, because people said, "No, I want my health care," that didn't happen. So I know people are exhausted. People should rest for a minute or 10 or 20 minutes. But the thing about democracy is it's designed for people to have power, including when you're in the opposition. And, once people are rested, I hope people feel that.
Well, I love talking to you, Jen. Thank you so
You
much for
too. Thank
indulging me
you.
and spending so much time with
Oh, I
me.
love talking to you. I love talking to you. Well, thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate it.
And congratulations on your success, and, I'm always cheering you on.
Thank you.